Hello devs, this is James Shockley coming to you with another tutorial for the MVC software architectural design pattern. Today we'll be taking a look at what that actually means and some reference code to see how it's implemented. So starting off at the top, what do we actually mean when we're talking about MVC or software architectural design pattern? Well, in this case, the MVC is standing for a model view controller, and this is going to define a couple of different ways that we can really use separation of concerns to componentize our interactions between the user as well as within the application itself and how we manage state. So this is really going to give us some guiding principles to how we write our code and to how we can internally compartmentalize how interactions are handled with both publicly to the user as well as within the application itself. So what we're looking at right now is a diagram which is not going to govern every single interaction that happens between the user and the application itself and the application internally within its own state, but 99% of them. 99% of them. We're not going to be code weenies and talk about that other 1% today. So we can really divide this into two hemispheres, and this is how I'm doing it. I like to look at it from a component of what is the user seeing, how is the user interacting with it, and what is the public-facing parts of our application. As well as the second hemisphere that I like to think about is how are we handling our application within the context of itself, or within specific contexts of interactions within the application state. So looking back to that first part, what is the user going to be doing when they're interacting with our application? Well, they're going to be looking at views. So let's do an example of that, and let's go to DuckDuckGo, and I'm going to be looking here at a view. DuckDuckGo, when I navigate there, it's going to send back to me a view, and that view is going to have my interactions through the application, at least assuming I stick to the UI, is going to be handled through that view. When I am looking up how to bake sweet potatoes, because I am one big sweet potato, that is going to be handled through the view. I wish I didn't click that so that we could go back and say that. Now, I don't know how much DuckDuckGo does this, but let's say I was typing in how to bake sweet potatoes, and it knows that I had recently searched for baking salmon. If that search is cached and DuckDuckGo were coloring my search requests based on context or something specific to my location, if it was coloring that in any way, then that content may be handled through an interaction with the controller. So it may be talking to some search suggestion service on the back end of the application, and effectively this view is only existing for me to interact with, to handle my inputs, and then it's talking to a controller that is going to be handling the content of that. Another good example of this is, let's go to Twitter, and I'm not a big tweeter, so you guys can see how little I know about it. But yes, our view is existing here to show content that is being fetched from a controller, probably like a timeline provider service. And it's seeing that I am a big fan of people who dress up and cosplay as sheep. And it's going to, that view is showing me that I you know what, this guy, he just loves sheep cosplay. And it's providing me, it's showing me what I want Nate demand by talking to that sheep content provider service. So that view is really existing to handle my inputs as well as to talk to the right controller on the back end. Now, if all of my interactions that I'm describing right here are being done through a view, then why does this arrow exist over here? Well, the user may be talking directly to a controller in some cases. If that, let's say that view is talking to an API. It's sending off requests, say for my user. It may be talking to and fetching that information from an API endpoint, and that endpoint may be accessible to me directly because, hey, developers are users too, right? So that could be one use case. But yes, I like this way of separating the way that user interacts with the application in a defined way, and separating out the content of the application as data that is communicated to and from a view and a controller. I think that's pretty cool. The view may also talk directly to a model. That could be a possibility. And a controller is likely talking to a model in the back end. So let's say again that my profile information is provided by a user profile provider service. That could be governed through a controller. And when we're talking about service, I'll try to use controller, but I'm effectively using these interchangeably. So yeah, that could be governed by a user provider controller. Now let's get to talking a little bit about the model. And again, I'm talking about all of this at a high level. Models are going to define our interactions with the database. And when I've been talking about state so far, effectively a lot of that state is coming from how we're storing information in the database, or how information is being made available to us from the database. So these sheep tweets, bless, it is existing somewhere in the database, and it is up to a controller. It is up to a controller to provide that to us, and it's doing that through talking to the models. So there could be a model for there is a model for my user, which may have some references to interests of mine. It may have some categories or buckets that it's placing me into. There's some association in there that says I love sheep cosplay. And that model is governing how we're interacting with the database, because you do not want your view directly talking to a database. You do not want your controller talking directly to a database. You want that to be handled through a model, because not only is that going to allow you another layer of definition between how that data is being stored, which is super important, especially for a document object stored database like Mongo that we'll be talking about when we review this application code. Because, of course, a feature of Mongo is that schemas are optional. So using a defined model is going to allow us some governance or some ability to control the way that information is stored, and not only stored, but presented from our database. So let's take that example. Why would we want that? Let's take that example of a user profile again. Let's say that, of course, Twitter, again, for example, it has a user profile for me. That user profile, the way it's presented, is going to depend on the context in which I'm interacting with it. Let's say that we have two examples here, one of which is a signed-in user who is viewing their own profile, and a public user who's looking at that user's profile. So I am going to have a lot more access to that information associated with my profile if I'm viewing it from within the context of a session that is signed into that same user profile that's being viewed. So I'm going to have access to a lot more private information. Like, I'm taking a guess at what information is super private on Twitter, but maybe my email, maybe my birthday, probably my driver's license picture if that's required for that Twitter Blue verification, and then somebody who's signed in, because I know some of the information is hidden behind a sign-in request, can view some public information, quote unquote, for my profiles, such as whom I'm following, who's following me, and some information about myself, like my description or bio, etc., my profile picture. But they aren't going to have access to like that private information from within the context of my signed-in browser. So it could be that both of those records exist within the same user object in the database. Again, assuming that they're using Mongo, a document object store database, I'm going to refer to it as an object. But yes, they may be referring to that same, let's say my user has a unique ID, it probably does, but they're referring to the same piece of information. They're likely not referring to two separate entries which are created for my public profile information and my private profile information, because that would be another layer of complexity and overhead to manage those two separate entries based on the context. It could be the case on massively distributed and scaled systems that there could be a read-only user profile database that's pushed out and updated on some frequency, but that's not a typical use case, but it could be the case. But again, we're just talking about the 99% right here. I'm letting myself get sidetracked and confused and hiding in the complexity and details. But yes, that is one use case of why it's important for us to have this knowledge of this design pattern where we can separate or define the way that we're interacting with information within our database as models. Yes, that public and private user profile context. So let's take a look into the code itself, and I will come back to you guys in a moment to do that.